The spring rain fell hard on the muddy roads of northern France. It was April 1945, and the war was dying, but it was not dead yet. German soldiers were running away from the Allied forces that pushed closer to the Rhine River every day. The once powerful German army was now broken into small groups, desperate and hungry. Klaus Brenner stood in his field kitchen and watched the rain. He was 45 years old with gray hair and tired eyes. Before the war, Klaus owned a small restaurant in Munich where people came from all over the city to taste his food. Now he wore a dirty German uniform and cooked for soldiers who might not live to see tomorrow. He was a Hauptfeldwebel, a master sergeant, but that rank meant nothing anymore. "They are getting closer," said Franz Müller, the youngest cook in their group. Franz was only 22, thin and always nervous. He had been drafted just 8 months ago. "I can hear the British tanks." Klaus nodded slowly. He could hear them too. The deep rumble of engines, the crack of rifles, the occasional boom of artillery. The sounds of defeat. Their supply depot sat at a crossroads between two small villages. Yesterday there were 200 German soldiers here. This morning there were only 30, and now Klaus could see them running through the rain, throwing away their weapons. "Should we run too?" asked Franz. His hands shook as he stirred a pot of soup that nobody would eat. "Where would we go?" Klaus asked quietly. "The British are in front of us. The Americans are behind us. The war is over, Franz. We just have not admitted it yet." The other 3 cooks in their unit looked at Klaus. They were all older men, too old for frontline fighting, but useful enough to feed soldiers. They had survived 4 years of war by staying in the kitchen, away from the bullets. Now, even that safety was gone. The sound of engines grew louder. Klaus untied his apron carefully and folded it like he was closing his restaurant for the night. "Put down your knives," he told his men. "When they come, raise your hands. Do not make them shoot us for no reason." Franz started to cry. "What will they do to us?" Klaus remembered the propaganda posters he had seen. The Nazi officials said the British would torture prisoners, that the Americans were barbarians. But Klaus was old enough to know that scared governments always lied to their people. "I do not know," he admitted. "But we are cooks, not SS men. We have not done terrible things. Maybe they will see that." The first British soldier appeared through the rain like a ghost. He was young, maybe 19, with a rifle pointed at the kitchen. More soldiers followed, spreading out, their uniforms soaked and muddy. They looked exhausted. Klaus noticed how thin they were, how their eyes had that hollow look of men who had seen too much death. "Hands up," shouted one of them. "Hand hoch." Klaus and his cooks raised their hands. Franz was shaking so hard his teeth chattered. The British soldiers surrounded them, weapons ready, expecting resistance that never came. An officer walked forward. He was taller than the others, maybe 28 years old, with a thin mustache and captain's insignias on his wet uniform. His name tag said Hartford. He looked at the 5 German cooks standing in their kitchen surrounded by pots, pans, and supplies. "You are prisoners of war," Lieutenant Hartford said slowly in decent German. "You will not be harmed if you cooperate. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Klaus answered in English that surprised the British officer. "We understand. We surrender." Hartford's eyebrows rose. "You speak English?" "A little," Klaus said. "I worked in a hotel in Switzerland before the war. I learned from tourists." The British soldiers searched them quickly, but not roughly. They took away anything that could be a weapon, even the kitchen knives. A young private with red hair looked at all the food supplies with wide eyes. "Bloody hell, Lieutenant," he said. "Look at all this. They have real flour, eggs, even coffee." Hartford walked through the kitchen, his boots splashing in puddles. He picked up a bag of flour, then looked at the neat rows of supplies. "This is a fortune in rations," he said quietly. "Our boys have been eating tinned beef and hard biscuits for weeks." Klaus watched the British soldiers stare at the food. He understood hunger. He had been feeding hungry soldiers for 4 years. These British soldiers had the same look as the German soldiers he fed. Young men, far from home, dreaming of their mother's cooking. "You are the head cook?" Hartford asked Klaus. "Yes, sir. Hauptfeldwebel Klaus Brenner. These are my men." "What did you do before the war?" "I owned a restaurant in Munich. A small place, nothing fancy, but people liked my food." Hartford studied Klaus for a long moment. There was something in the British officer's face, a kind of tired respect. "War makes soldiers out of cooks and cooks out of soldiers," Hartford said quietly. Then louder, to his men, secure the prisoners. Private Wells, get the trucks. We are taking all of them back to the holding area. The red-haired private named Wells looked disappointed. Even the food, sir? Especially the food, Hartford said. They loaded Klaus and his cooks into the back of a military truck. Through the canvas cover, Klaus watched his kitchen disappear into the rain. Franz was still crying silently. The other cooks sat with their heads down, defeated, but Klaus felt something strange. Relief. The war was over for him. No more cooking in the mud. No more feeding boys who would die tomorrow. Whatever came next, it could not be worse than the last 4 years. The truck drove through destroyed villages and past burned tanks. They saw columns of German prisoners walking in the rain, thousands of them, the remains of Hitler's once great army. Klaus had believed in Germany once, believed they were fighting for something important. Now he just felt old and tired. After 2 hours, they arrived at a small French village that the British had turned into a temporary prisoner camp. There were already hundreds of German soldiers there, sitting in the rain behind wire fences, guarded by British troops. The truck stopped, and the prisoners climbed out. "Line up," ordered a British sergeant with a thick Scottish accent. "You will be processed and assigned quarters." Klaus and his men stood in line with the other prisoners. They gave their names, ranks, and units. A board clerk wrote everything down. When it was Klaus's turn, Lieutenant Hartford was standing nearby, watching. "This one speaks English," Hartford told the clerk, "and he is a professional cook. Make a note of that." The clerk looked up with interest. "A cook, sir?" "Real cook. Owned a restaurant." Hartford confirmed that as they were led away to the prisoner barracks. Klaus wondered why the British officer had made sure to mention his cooking skills. But he was too tired to think about it much. For the first time in months, nobody was shooting at him. That was enough for now. That night, Klaus lay on a thin mattress in a crowded room full of defeated German soldiers. Through the window, he could smell something cooking. British rations, poorly prepared, barely edible. He smiled slightly in the darkness. Even in defeat, even as a prisoner, Klaus Brenner was still a cook. And cooks always noticed bad food. Tomorrow would bring new worries. But tonight, the war was finally over. The prisoner camp grew larger every day. What started as a small holding area for 200 German soldiers had swelled to over 300 in just 1 week. They kept coming, surrendering German troops from all directions, some wounded, all exhausted and hungry. The British had not planned for so many prisoners so quickly. The war was ending faster than anyone expected. Klaus woke each morning to the same sounds. Guards shouting orders in English. Prisoners coughing in the cold dawn air. The rumble of trucks bringing more defeated soldiers. He had been a prisoner for 8 days now, and each day felt longer than the last. There was nothing to do except sit and wait and wonder what would happen next. The food was terrible. The British gave each prisoner 1 small tin of meat, a piece of hard bread, and weak tea twice a day. It was barely enough to survive. Klaus watched young soldiers, already thin from months of retreat, become even thinner. Franz had lost so much weight that his uniform hung on him like a scarecrow's clothes. "I am so hungry," Franz whispered one morning. "I dream about my mother's potato soup every night." Klaus said nothing. He was hungry too, but complaining did not fill an empty stomach. He had learned that lesson long ago. The British soldiers were not cruel. They followed the rules of the Geneva Convention, the international law that said prisoners must be treated humanely. But they were stretched thin, trying to manage hundreds of prisoners with limited supplies. Klaus could see the stress on their faces. The guards were just as tired and hungry as the prisoners on the 9th day. Something changed as a British major arrived at the camp in a clean uniform that looked out of place among all the mud and exhaustion. His name was Richard Ashford, and Klaus could tell immediately that he was the kind of officer who actually thought about problems instead of just shouting orders. Ashford walked through the camp slowly, studying everything with sharp eyes. That afternoon, Ashford inspected the captured German supplies that had been stored in a warehouse. Klaus heard about it from a guard who spoke a little German. "Your supplies are better than ours," the guard said with a bitter laugh. "Even in defeat, you Germans eat better than we do." The next morning, Klaus was summoned to the camp headquarters. 2 guards escorted him across the muddy compound to a small building that the British used as their command post. Franz watched him go with frightened eyes. "Am I in trouble?" Klaus asked the guards in English. One of them shrugged. "The major wants to talk to you. That is all I know." Inside the building, It was warmer and drier. Major Ashford sat behind a wooden desk covered with papers and maps. Lieutenant Hartford stood beside him. An interpreter was also there, a French civilian who worked for the British Army. "Sit down, Hauptfeldwebel-Brenner," Ashford said through the interpreter. Klaus sat carefully on a wooden chair, his hands folded in his lap. He studied the major's face, trying to understand what was coming. In his experience, when officers wanted to talk to you privately, it was either very good or very bad news. Ashford leaned forward. "Lieutenant Hartford tells me you owned a restaurant before the war. Is that true?" "Yes, sir. A small restaurant in Munich. Nothing fancy, but people came for the food." "And you can cook for large groups?" "You did that in the German army." "Yes, sir. I cooked for my company, sometimes up to 150 men." Ashford exchanged a glance with Hartford. Something was happening, but Klaus could not understand what yet. The major stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the crowded prisoner camp. "Hauptfeldwebel-Brenner, I have a problem," Ashford said quietly. "I have over 300 German prisoners and more arriving every day. My supply lines are stretched to breaking. The food we have is barely enough, and what we can prepare tastes like leather soup. My men are tired of tinned beef. The prisoners are starving. And sitting in my warehouse is enough captured German supplies to feed everyone properly for weeks. But nobody here knows how to cook for this many people." Klaus began to understand. His heart beat faster. Ashford turned from the window. "I am going to make you an unusual offer. I want you and your cooking team to prepare meals for this entire camp, British soldiers and German prisoners alike. You will use the captured supplies and whatever else we can provide. You will cook real food, proper meals, the way you did in your restaurant." Klaus stared at the major. He could not believe what he was hearing. "Sir, I do not understand. You want German prisoners to cook for British soldiers." "I want a professional cook to do his job," Ashford said firmly. "You are a cook. I need food prepared for over 400 men. This is not complicated." "But sir," Klaus struggled to find words. "How can you trust us? We were your enemy yesterday. What if someone thinks we will poison the food?" Hartford spoke for the first time. "That is why you will cook the same food for everyone. You will eat from the same pots as my soldiers. If the food is poisoned, you poison yourself." Klaus thought about this carefully. It made sense, but it was still strange. In all his time in the German army, he had never heard of anything like this. Prisoners cooking for their captors. It seemed impossible. "What if I refuse?" Klaus asked quietly. Ashford smiled slightly. "Then you will continue to eat terrible food like everyone else, and we will all be miserable together. But I do not think you will refuse." "Why not?" "Because you are a cook, Hauptfeldwebel. And cooks cannot stand to see people eat bad food when they could make something better. It is not in your nature." Klaus felt something stir in his chest. The major was right. For 8 days Klaus had watched soldiers, British and German, force down food that no human should have to eat. It offended him professionally. He had spent his whole life making food that brought people joy, and now everyone around him was suffering from bad cooking. "My men," Klaus said, "Franz and the others. They would help me. Of course, I am not asking you to cook for 400 men alone. Your entire team will work together, under guard of course. You will have access to the kitchen facilities and supplies. You will plan the meals and prepare them as you see fit." Klaus looked at Lieutenant Hartford. "And you trust this? You believe it will work?" Hartford met his eyes. "I think you are a professional who takes pride in his work. I think you would rather die than serve a bad meal. And I think this war has gone on long enough that maybe we can remember we are all just men who need to eat." There was a long silence. Klaus thought about his restaurant in Munich, destroyed now by Allied bombs probably. He thought about 4 years of cooking in the mud and rain, feeding boys who died before they could digest their last meal. He thought about Franz and the others, wasting away on tinned meat and hard bread. "I will do it," Klaus said. "But I have conditions." Ashford raised an eyebrow. "A prisoner making conditions?" "I am a cook making conditions," Klaus said with a hint of his old pride. "If I cook properly. I need clean facilities, sharp knives, freedom to plan my own menus. And my men must not be treated badly while they work." Ashford thought about this, then nodded. "Agreed. You will have what you need. But if there is any trouble, any suspicion of sabotage, the arrangement ends immediately." "Understood." "Understood, sir. Then we start tomorrow morning. Lieutenant Hartford will arrange everything." As Klaus was escorted back to the prisoner barracks, his mind was already racing with possibilities. What could he make with German flour, British tinned vegetables, and French herbs? How could he turn basic supplies into meals that would feed hungry men properly? Franz rushed to him when he entered the barracks. What happened? Are you okay? Klaus smiled for the first time in days. Get the others. Tell them tomorrow we cook again. Cook? Here? For who? Klaus looked around at the crowded room full of defeated German soldiers. Then he looked through the window at the exhausted British guards. For everyone, he said simply. Tomorrow we cook for everyone. The kitchen was in an old French barn that the British had converted into a cooking facility. When Klaus and his 4 cooks arrived under armed guard the next morning, he stopped at the entrance and studied everything with a professional eye. It was basic but workable. There were 3 large cooking stoves salvaged from German field kitchens, long wooden tables for preparation, and enough pots and pans to cook for an army, which is exactly what he had to do. Right then, said Sergeant Bill Morrison, the gruff Scottish guard assigned to watch them. Everything you do, I watch. You reach for a knife, I see it. You add ingredients, I know what they are. And if I see anything suspicious, anything at all, you will regret it. Clear, clear, Klaus said calmly. He understood. Morrison was doing his job, keeping his soldiers safe. Klaus would have done the same. Private Tommy Wells stood by the door, his red hair bright in the morning light. He was supposed to help Morrison guard the German cooks, but his eyes kept drifting to the food supplies with hunger. Klaus had noticed this young soldier before. He was always hungry, always watching when food appeared. Tommy, Morrison barked. Stop dreaming about your stomach and stay alert. Yes, Sergeant, Tommy said, but his eyes did not leave the sacks of flour. Klaus gathered his team around one of the wooden tables. Franz was nervous as always. The other 3 cooks, older men named Otto, Wilhelm, and Peter, looked uncertain but ready to work. For the first time in over a week, they had a purpose. Listen carefully, Klaus said in German. Today we show them what real cooking is. We work with dignity. We work with pride. They may have defeated our army, but they have not defeated our skill. Understood, the 4 men nodded. Klaus saw something change in their eyes. They were not just prisoners anymore. They were cooks again. Klaus walked through the supplies, taking inventory in his head. There were sacks of German flour, British tinned vegetables, sugar, salt, dried herbs, and even some coffee. In a cool storage area, he found eggs from local French farms and apples from an abandoned orchard. It was not much compared to his restaurant, but it was a fortune compared to what they had been eating. We will make bread first, Klaus announced. Real bread, not those hard biscuits. Then a vegetable stew with herbs and seasoning. An apple crumble for dessert if there is time. Franz stared at him. Dessert? For prisoners? For everyone, Klaus corrected. The major said we cook for the whole camp. So we cook properly. Morrison watched suspiciously as Klaus began organizing the work. Otto and Peter started on the bread dough, kneading it on the wooden tables. Wilhelm prepared vegetables, his knife moving with practiced efficiency despite being watched by armed guards. Franz worked on the stew, carefully measuring spices and herbs. Klaus supervised everything, tasting, adjusting, instructing. He fell into the old rhythm of his restaurant kitchen, the familiar dance of cooking that he had known for 30 years. For a few hours, he forgot he was a prisoner. He was just a cook again, doing what he loved. The smell of baking bread began to fill the barn. Morrison's stern expression softened slightly. That smells good, he admitted grudgingly. Tommy Wells looked like he might cry. I have not smelled fresh bread since I left England, he whispered. My mum used to bake every Sunday. The aroma drifted across the camp. German prisoners stopped their morning routines and turned toward the kitchen barn, their faces confused and hopeful. British soldiers on guard duty sniffed the air like hungry dogs. Even Major Ashford, working in his office, smelled it and smiled. By noon, the first meal was ready. Klaus stood back and looked at what his team had created. 4 large pots of vegetable stew, rich with herbs and properly seasoned. 60 loaves of fresh bread, golden brown and still warm. And 3 trays of apple crumble, simple but honest. It is ready, Klaus told Morrison. The sergeant inspected everything carefully, smelling, looking for anything suspicious. Then he took a small piece of bread and tasted it. His eyes widened. Bloody hell, he muttered. Then louder, Wells, go tell the major the food is ready. Tommy ran like his boots were on fire. They served the British soldiers first. Lieutenant Hartford came with a group of 20 men, all of them tired and dirty from weeks of combat. They lined up with their metal mess kits, expecting the usual terrible rations. When they saw the bread and smelled the stew, they looked confused. Klaus served the first portion himself, ladling stew into Hartford's kit and handing him a thick slice of bread. Hartford stared at the food like it was a miracle. "This is real food," Hartford said quietly. "Yes, sir. Real food," Klaus replied. The British soldiers found places to sit and ate in complete silence. Klaus watched their faces. He saw the exact moment when they tasted the bread, the way their expressions changed from exhaustion to something like joy. Some of them closed their eyes. One young soldier wiped tears from his face. Tommy Wells took his first bite and made a sound that was almost a sob. "It tastes like home," he whispered. After the British soldiers ate, the German prisoners were served. They approached the serving line with confusion and suspicion. Why was the food different today? What had changed? But when they received their portions, real portions of real food, they understood something unusual was happening. Klaus watched them eat. He saw the same transformation, the same moment of recognition that food could be more than fuel, that even in a prison camp, even in defeat, there could be dignity in a good meal. Major Ashford arrived at the end of the lunch service. He accepted a plate from Klaus and stood there in the barn, eating with his soldiers and prisoners around him. When he finished, he set down his empty plate and looked at Klaus for a long moment. "Hauptfeldwebel Ashford said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This is the best meal I have eaten in 3 months. You have my thanks." Klaus stood at attention, as much as a prisoner could. "I am a cook, sir. This is what I do." Ashford nodded slowly. Then he turned to the British soldiers. "From now on, Hauptfeldwebel and his team will prepare our meals. I expect you to treat them with the respect that professionals deserve. They are still prisoners, still under guard, but they are cooks first. Any man who disrespects their work will answer to me." The British soldiers nodded. Some of them looked at Klaus with new eyes, seeing not an enemy but a man who had given them something precious. That evening, as Klaus and his team were escorted back to the prisoner barracks, something had changed in the camp. German prisoners watched them pass with curiosity and hope. British guards nodded respectfully. Tommy Wells walked beside them, no longer just a guard but something else, something new. "That bread," Tommy said quietly. "Could you teach me to make it?" Klaus looked at the young British soldier, this boy who yesterday had been his enemy. "Yes," Klaus said. "I could teach you." Franz heard this and looked at Klaus like he was crazy. Teaching British soldiers to cook? But Klaus understood something that Franz did not yet see. In the kitchen, making food, sharing meals, they were not enemies. They were just hungry men who needed to eat. That night, Klaus slept better than he had in weeks. His hands smelled like bread dough. His back ached from standing all day. He was still a prisoner in a camp far from home. But for the first time since the war began, Klaus Brenner felt like himself again. The next morning, when the guards came to collect them, Tommy Wells was waiting by the door with a notebook. "I want to learn everything," he said eagerly. "My mom always said I should learn to cook properly." Morrison rolled his eyes, but did not stop him. As they walked to the kitchen barn, Klaus heard German prisoners calling out to him. "What did you make today, Brenner? Will there be more bread? Can you make soup with meat?" Klaus smiled. He had spent 4 years in the German army, had cooked for thousands of soldiers, had survived the entire war. But he had never felt as important as he did right now. Walking to a barn kitchen in a French village, about to cook breakfast for 400 hungry men who did not care anymore if he was German or British or French. They just cared that he was a good cook. 2 weeks passed like a dream that Klaus sometimes thought could not be real. Every morning he woke up in the prisoner barracks, and every morning guards escorted him to the kitchen barn where he spent the day doing what he loved most. Cooking, creating, feeding hungry people. The kitchen had become the heart of the camp. It was the one place where Germans and British worked side by side, united by the simple need to prepare meals. Tommy Wells came every day now, and Morrison had stopped pretending to object. The young British soldier had real talent for cooking, Klaus discovered. His hands were quick, and he learned fast. "You must knead the dough longer," Klaus instructed one morning, showing Tommy the proper technique. "Feel how it becomes smooth? That is when you know it is ready." Tommy copied Klaus's movements, his tongue sticking out in concentration. Like this. Better. Much better. Franz watched this with amazement. 3 weeks ago, Tommy had been pointing a rifle at them. Now he was learning to make bread from Klaus like an apprentice in a restaurant. The world had gone mad, Franz thought, but maybe it was a good kind of madness. The meals had become more sophisticated as Klaus gained confidence with the available supplies. He made potato pancakes using a recipe his grandmother had taught him. He created a soup using tinned beef, but added so many herbs and vegetables that it tasted almost good. He even managed a simple cake for Major Ashford's birthday, using hoarded eggs and sugar. The British soldiers loved him. The German prisoners were proud of him. And Klaus felt more alive than he had in years. But the supplies were running low. On the 15th day, Klaus stood in the storage room and faced a problem. They had flour for maybe 3 more days. The vegetables were almost gone. The sugar was finished. And more prisoners arrived every day, hungry mouths that needed feeding. What do we do? Franz asked nervously. When the food runs out, do we go back to tinned meat and hard bread? Klaus thought for a long moment. Then he went to find Major Ashford. The major was in his office, surrounded by papers and maps. The war in Europe was in its final days now. Everyone knew Hitler was finished. The German army was collapsing everywhere. But there was still paperwork, still decisions to make, still a camp full of prisoners to manage. Sir, Klaus said through the doorway. I need to speak with you. Ashford looked up and smiled. Come in, Hauptfeldwebel. How is our kitchen today? That is the problem, sir. We are running out of supplies. In 3 days, maybe 4, there will be nothing left to cook with. Ashford's smile faded. I know. I have been requesting more supplies from headquarters, but everything is chaos right now. Half of France is still liberated zones with broken supply lines. Klaus hesitated, then spoke carefully. Sir, I have an idea. Before the war, when my restaurant ran low on supplies, I would go to the countryside. French villages always have food if you know where to look. Wild mushrooms in the forests, rabbits to hunt, gardens with vegetables. If you would allow me and my team, with guards of course, to go foraging in the area, I think we could find enough to continue cooking. Ashford leaned back in his chair, studying Klaus. You want me to take German prisoners outside the camp? To give you knives for foraging and let you wander the countryside? With armed guards, Klaus said quickly. I am not asking for freedom. I am asking for ingredients. You could escape. I could, Klaus admitted. But where would I go? The war is over, Major. Germany is destroyed. My restaurant is probably rubble. Here I have a purpose. I have work I care about. Why would I throw that away to run through the woods like a scared rabbit? Ashford studied him for a long time. Then he called for Lieutenant Hartford. When Hartford arrived, Ashford explained Klaus's idea. Hartford listened, then looked at Klaus with something like respect. It is risky, Hartford said, but I think he is right. The French villagers probably have supplies they would trade. You trust him? Ashford asked. Hartford nodded slowly. I do. He has had a dozen chances to cause trouble and has not. He cares more about cooking than anything else. Ashford made his decision. All right. Tomorrow morning, you will take Hauptfeldwebel Brenner, 1 other cook, and 4 armed guards. You will forage in the nearby countryside. But if anything goes wrong, if there is any trouble at all, it stops immediately. Klaus felt relief flood through him. Thank you, sir. You will not regret this. The next morning, Klaus, Franz, Lieutenant Hartford, Sergeant Morrison, and 4 British soldiers left the camp. It felt strange to be outside the wire fence, walking on roads as almost a free man. The French countryside was beautiful in late April. Spring flowers bloomed beside roads damaged by tanks. Birds sang in trees that had survived artillery fire. The war had passed through here, but nature was already healing. They walked to a small village 2 kilometers away. French civilians watched them approach with caution. German prisoners walking with British soldiers was an unusual sight. Hartford spoke to them in his careful French, explaining what they needed. An old French woman listened, then spat on the ground. Why should I give food to German prisoners? She asked angrily in French. The Germans took everything from us for 4 years. Klaus understood enough French to know what she said. He stepped forward slowly, his hands visible and empty. Madam, he said in his basic French, I am sorry for what happened to France. I am only a cook. I feed British soldiers and German prisoners the same food. Everyone is hungry. Everyone needs to eat. The war is ending. Maybe we can start healing. The old woman looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Lieutenant Hartford and the British soldiers. These British boys, they treat you well. Yes, madam. They are fair. She nodded slowly. My grandson was killed by Germans in 1943. He was 19 years old. Her eyes filled with tears. But I suppose you did not kill him. You were just cooking somewhere. I am sorry for your grandson, Klaus said quietly. The woman wiped her eyes. I have potatoes, carrots, some onions. You can take them. For the British soldiers, not for you. But I suppose if you all eat together, there is nothing I can do about that. Other villagers came forward with small offerings. Mushrooms from the forest, 3 rabbits that a boy had snared, a sack of old apples, herbs from gardens. It was not much, but it was something. It was hope that as they walked back to camp, their bags full of food, Klaus felt something he had not felt in years. Not happiness exactly, but something close. Purpose, connection, the sense that even in terrible times, people could still be kind. Tommy had come along on the expedition and walked beside Klaus. You spoke French to that woman, Tommy said with admiration. I did not know you spoke French. Only a little, Klaus said. I picked it up in Switzerland. You have been everywhere, Tommy said. Switzerland, Germany, now France. I have only been to London and then here for the war. Maybe after the war you will travel, Klaus suggested. See other places. Learn other cooking. Tommy was quiet for a moment. Klaus, he said, using the first name that had become natural between them. What will happen when the camp closes? Where will you go? It was a question Klaus had been avoiding. I do not know. Back to Germany eventually. Maybe try to rebuild my restaurant if anything is left. You should come to England, Tommy said suddenly. My mom would love you. She has been trying to teach me to cook for years. You could stay with us until things settled down. Klaus felt emotion tighten his throat. This boy, whose country had been at war with Germany for 6 years, was offering him a home. That is kind, Tommy. Very kind. That evening, Klaus prepared a feast with the foraged ingredients. Rabbit stew with mushrooms and herbs. Roasted potatoes with wild garlic. Apple tart using the last of the sugar. It was the best meal he had made in the camp that the soldiers and prisoners ate. Klaus heard news from Lieutenant Hartford. The BBC says Hitler is dead, Hartford announced. The war in Europe is almost over. Maybe days now, maybe weeks, but it is finished. The camp went quiet. German prisoners looked at each other with mixed emotions. Relief that the dying would stop. Grief for their destroyed country. Fear for what came next. The British soldiers felt similar things. Joy that they had survived. Sorrow for friends who had not. Uncertainty about the future. Klaus stood in his kitchen and felt the weight of it all. The war that had stolen 6 years of his life was ending. Everything he had known was gone. His restaurant, his city, his country, all destroyed. But here in this small kitchen in a French village, cooking for former enemies who had become something like friends, Klaus discovered he still had hope. Later that night, Franz asked him, "What do we do now? When the camp closes, where do we go?" Klaus thought about the old French woman who had given them potatoes despite her grief. He thought about Tommy offering him a home in England. He thought about Major Ashford trusting him enough to let him leave the camp. He thought about all the small kindnesses that had happened in this strange place. We survive, Franz, Klaus said. We rebuild. We cook again. The war is ending, but life continues. And people will always need to eat. The news came on a bright morning in early May. The war in Europe was officially over. Germany had surrendered. After 6 years of death and destruction, the guns were finally silent. In the prisoner camp, the announcement brought strange emotions. The British soldiers cheered and hugged each other. The German prisoners sat quietly, processing the end of everything they had known. Klaus was in the kitchen when he heard. He stopped stirring the pot of soup he was making and stood very still. It was over. Really over. He had survived the entire war by feeding soldiers, first German and now British. He was 45 years old, far from home. Everything he owned was probably destroyed, but he was alive. That had to count for something. 3 days after the surrender, Lieutenant Hartford came to the kitchen with news that Klaus had been dreading. Orders have come from headquarters, Hartford said quietly. The camp will be disbanded in 1 week. German prisoners will be transferred to larger facilities before repatriation. Our unit moves on to occupation duties in Germany. Franz, who was peeling potatoes nearby, dropped his knife. 1 week? We have to leave in 1 week. Klaus felt his stomach tighten. He had known this was coming. but knowing and facing it were different things. This kitchen, this routine, these people had become his whole world. Now it would all end. Where will we go? Franz asked, his voice shaking. You will be processed through the main POW center near Paris, Hartford explained. From there, eventually back to Germany. It might take months, but you will go home. Home, Franz repeated bitterly. What home? Germany is destroyed. Klaus put his hand on the young man's shoulder. We will rebuild, he said firmly. Germans are good at rebuilding. We will do it again. That evening, Klaus made a decision. If they had only 1 week left, he would make it count. He would prepare one final meal that everyone would remember. A farewell feast that would remind them all that even in the darkest times, there could be beauty and kindness. He went to Major Ashford with his request. Sir, I would like permission to use all remaining supplies to prepare a special meal for the camp. One last proper dinner before we separate. Ashford looked at him thoughtfully. All the supplies? That is quite bold, hopped Feldwebel. We will not need them after this week, sir. Better to use them for something memorable than let them go to waste. Ashford smiled. Very well. Make us something worth remembering. Klaus spent the next 3 days planning and preparing. He used every skill he had learned in 30 years of cooking. He convinced Morrison to take him to 2 more French villages to trade for ingredients. He worked his team harder than ever before, but they did not complain. Everyone understood this was important. Franz became Klaus's right hand, anticipating needs before Klaus spoke them. Otto and Wilhelm worked like men possessed, determined to contribute to something special. Peter, who was 60 years old and had barely spoken since their capture, suddenly became talkative, sharing recipes his wife used to make. Tommy Wells helped every day, learning, watching, absorbing everything Klaus taught him. I want to do this after the war, Tommy confided. Really do it. Go to cooking school, maybe open my own place someday. You have the talent, Klaus told him honestly. And more important, you have the passion. That matters more than anything. Will you write down your recipes? Tommy asked. So I can remember them? Klaus looked at the young British soldier who had become like a son to him in these few weeks. Better than that. I will teach you how to think like a cook. Recipes are just words on paper. Understanding food, that is the real skill. The day of the final feast arrived. Klaus and his team had prepared a meal that would feed over 400 people. There was roasted chicken that the French villagers had donated, seeing it as a thank you to the British liberators. There were vegetables cooked 3 different ways. There was fresh bread, of course, golden and perfect. There was a soup rich with herbs. And for dessert, Klaus had created something special. A cake decorated with icing in patterns that represented both Britain and Germany, side by side. Major Ashford had arranged for tables to be set up in the center of the camp. British soldiers and German prisoners would eat together, side by side, one last time. It was unprecedented, possibly even against regulations, but Ashford did not care. The war was over. The rules could bend for one evening. As the sun began to set, Klaus stood before the assembled crowd. Over 400 men, British and German, former enemies, all gathered to share a meal. Lieutenant Hartford had asked him to say something before they ate. Klaus was not a man comfortable with speeches. He cooked, he did not talk. But looking out at all those faces, he knew he had to try. I am not good with words. He began in English, speaking slowly so everyone could understand. I am a cook. I make food. That is what I know. But these weeks here, cooking for all of you, have taught me something important. Food is more than just eating. When we share a meal, when we sit together and eat the same food, we remember that we are all human. We all get hungry. We all need to eat. It does not matter if we are British or German or French. In the kitchen, we are just people who need feeding. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Franz stood beside him, translating for the German prisoners who did not speak English. 3 weeks ago, I was just another prisoner, defeated and scared. Major Ashford gave me a chance to do what I love. Lieutenant Hartford trusted me when he had no reason to trust. Sergeant Morrison watched over us but treated us with respect. And Private Wells became my student and my friend. You all ate the food we made without fear or suspicion. You saw cooks, not enemies. Klaus felt emotion rise in his throat. I do not know what happens next. I do not know if I will ever see my home again or rebuild my restaurant. But I will remember this place. I will remember that even after 6 years of terrible war, people can still be kind. We can still share a meal together. We can still see each other as human beings. He gestured to the tables full of food. So please, eat. Enjoy. And remember that no matter what country we come from, we all deserve good food and kindness. There was silence for a moment. Then Major Ashford began to clap. The British soldiers joined in. And then, slowly, the German prisoners clapped too. It was not a celebration exactly. It was something more complicated. Recognition, respect, acknowledgement that something unusual and valuable had happened here. The feast was magnificent. Klaus watched as British soldiers and German prisoners sat together, passing bread, sharing stories through broken translation, laughing at jokes that crossed language barriers. For a few hours, the war felt very far away. After everyone had eaten their fill, Major Ashford stood and made an announcement. I have written official commendations for Hauptfeldwebel and his cooking team. These documents note your cooperation, your professionalism, and your character. When you are processed for repatriation, these papers will go with you. They may help you in the difficult times ahead. Klaus felt tears in his eyes. Such papers could make the difference between easy treatment and hard treatment in a POW processing center. Ashford was giving them a gift that might save them months of suffering. Thank you, sir, Klaus said, his voice rough with emotion. We will not forget this. That night, Klaus gave Tommy his handwritten recipes, carefully copied onto paper that Hartford had provided. But more than that, he gave Tommy something more valuable. His professional kitchen knife, the one he had carried through the entire war, the one that had survived when everything else was lost. I cannot take this, Tommy protested. It is too important to you. That is why you must take it, Klaus said firmly. You will use it well. You will become a great cook. And when you use it, you will remember that even in the worst times, people can still learn from each other. A German can teach a British boy to cook. Enemies can become friends. Tommy hugged him, which was absolutely against regulations for a guard to hug a prisoner, but nobody stopped them. The next morning came too quickly. The German prisoners were loaded onto trucks for the journey to the processing center. Klaus stood with Franz and the others, their small bags of belongings in their hands. The British soldiers lined up, not as guards, but as something else. Fellows, colleagues, friends. Tommy stood in the front row, tears streaming down his face. I will write to you, he called out. I will find you in Munich. I promise. I will wait for that letter, Klaus called back. Learn everything. Cook everything. Make me proud. As the trucks began to move, Klaus looked back at the camp one last time. He saw the kitchen barn where magic had happened. He saw Major Ashford saluting. He saw Lieutenant Hartford with his hand raised in farewell. He saw Sergeant Morrison actually smiling. And he saw Tommy Wells, standing there with the knife Klaus had given him, waving until the trucks turned a corner and the camp disappeared from view. Franz was crying beside him. What do we do now? He asked, the same question he always asked. Klaus thought about the meal they had shared last night. He thought about Tommy's promise to write. He thought about Ashford's commendation papers in his pocket. He thought about all the small kindnesses that had happened in that impossible place. We go home, Klaus said. We rebuild. We cook again. And we remember that humanity can survive even the worst wars. 2 years later, Klaus stood in his new restaurant in Munich. It was smaller than his old place, built in the rubble of the destroyed city. But it was his. He had rebuilt it with his own hands, using money from loans and help from neighbors. The sign outside said, Brenner's Kitchen, just like before the war. On the wall behind the counter, Klaus had hung something special. A British military knife, polished and displayed in a place of honor. Next to it was a letter, framed carefully. It was from England, from a young man who had just completed culinary school. The letter said, Dear Klaus, I am learning everything, just like you taught me. Next month, I start work in a real restaurant in London. I use your knife every day. I think of you every time I bake bread. Thank you for showing me that cooking is not just about food. It is about bringing people together. I hope to visit Munich soon and eat in your restaurant. Maybe I can teach you something new this time. Your friend always, Tommy Wells. Klaus smiled as he read the letter again, even though he had already read it 100 times. The war had taken so much from so many people. But in a small prisoner camp in France, for a few short weeks, something beautiful had happened. Enemies had become friends. Fear had become trust. And a German cook had fed both sides of a war, reminding everyone that beneath the uniforms and flags, They were all just hungry human beings who needed kindness. A customer entered the restaurant, bringing Klaus back to the present. "Good evening," Klaus said warmly. "Welcome to Brenner's Kitchen. Are you hungry?" The customer nodded. "Very hungry. What do you recommend?" Klaus smiled. "I recommend everything. I cook with my whole heart. It is what I do best." And he did. Every single day, Klaus cooked with the same passion he had shown in that French prison camp. He fed people, made them happy, reminded them that even in a world that had been so broken, there was still beauty in a good meal shared with others. The war was over. Life continued, and Klaus Brenner cooked on, remembering always that food could do more than fill stomachs. It could heal hearts, build bridges, and prove that humanity could survive anything. Even war. The Share Artifacts download all captured German cook's outline document, MD.